Hi everyone. In part 3 of this tutorial, I'm going to show how to organize your UI menus into different canvases and panels and scenes. I'm going to be using the same assets I used last time with the up state, down state, and hover state of my buttons and my one flat UI element which I am going to use to be the background for my panels. I'm going to start by creating a new scene, which is going to be my start screen. So I'll create a new scene, and the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to save this scene. I'm going to save it into my scenes folder, and I'm going to call it start screen. Now I'm going to create a canvas in my start screen. Under Game Object, UI, Canvas, and I'll just double click on the canvas so I can zoom out to it. And once again, notice that the event system has been created to go along with this canvas. As I did last time, the first thing I want to do is change from constant pixel size to scale with screen size. And now I'm ready to start creating my start screen. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to create a panel that's going to be the backdrop of my start screen. Now, a lot of games will have some menu art that will appear in their start screen. So if you create some art that you want to use in this start screen, this is a great place to set that up. I'm just going to use my green rectangle as my background. So I'm going to create a new panel. By default, it covers the whole screen, which is how I want it. And I have my green rectangle that I've created here that's already been sliced in the previous tutorial. And so I can just drag that to the background. And now I have my background for my start screen. Now you can see that the color it appears on here is not the same as the color I have in my UI asset. That's because the panel has some transparency by default, and the camera in my new scene has gone back to this default blue. So first thing I can do is I can make my background color black so that I don't have any color bleeding through or around the edges. And then I can also, on my panel, I can determine how transparent or opaque I want it to be. So I don't want it to be this super bright green, so I am going to leave it somewhat transparent. And then on this panel, so this panel is going to hold all of the contents of my start screen. So I'm actually going to rename the panel Start Menu. So this is going to be how I organize all of my UI assets into different screens. So I have my Start Menu, and now I'm going to create a button. And I'm going to take this button, I'm going to drag it so that I'm hovering over the start menu panel and release, and now the button is parented to the start menu. Now if I select the start menu and turn it on and off, I can see the button turns on and off with it. So this button, I'm going to make my start button. I'm going to take my up state of my button and drag it onto the source image and set native size. And then I'm going to change from color tint to sprite swap, and here's where I will add my highlighted and my pressed sprite and my selected sprite, which is, for my selected sprite, I'm just using the upstate again. Then for my text, I can increase the font size a bit here, and I can choose the font that I want to use. I'll use this one, and maybe even increase the font a bit more. And the text appears to be a little bit low on the button compared to what I would like. So I can, in my scene view, I can use the move tool to drag my text up slightly until it looks like it is centered properly in the button. Then I can change this text. This first button is going to be my start button. If this is our start screen, we need to have a start button. And I like to rename my buttons so that they're easier to distinguish. So I will name this button Start Button. and drag it up a little bit. I want my X to be 0 so that it's in the center. Now I'm going to Control D to duplicate this button. My second button is going to be my Options button. And when I duplicated it, it made this one also a child of my Start Menu panel. So now I can bring this one down. And one thing that is important to notice is the rectangles around these buttons overlap a little bit here, and these rectangles actually determine the hit area where the player can hover over. And so it's important to make sure that there is very little overlap between them. That way the user doesn't have trouble hovering over the correct button. So I'm going to change the text for my Options button to say Options. And then I'm going to make a third button, which will be my Exit button. This is only necessary on PC games. Mobile games would not use an Exit button. And if you wanted to have different kinds of option menus, that would be something you might consider including here. Maybe you have graphics options and you have difficulty settings. Maybe you have a save or load menu. That would also be a useful thing to include on this screen. But I'm just going to use these 3 simple buttons for this demonstration. So now I have my 3 buttons. The other thing I need is I need some text at the top. That's the title of the game. So I'm going to create UI text. And I'm going to take this text and I'm going to drag it onto the Start Menu panel so that now it's a child of the Start menu, just like my buttons. And then I would once again choose the font that I want to use for this one. And I would give a title to my game. And I probably would center my text inside of this text box and center the text box for my X position. And I want the text to be near the top, and I do want it to stay near the top. So just like in the previous video, I'm going to choose the binding drop down and bind it to the top edge of the screen. I'm going to increase the width and the height of the text box itself. This is not scaling the text, this is just increasing the space that the text can take up. And now I can increase my font size. And I can change the font color. You can also add outlines to text components, which can be helpful to help the text to sort of pop out from the background. So you might have a white outline around dark colored text or a black outline around light colored text. This helps improve the contrast so it's easier to read what the text says. And to add that, I just chose Add Component and searched for Outline, and it's this top default outline component. And you can add it to just about any UI element. It works really well with text. Now I'm going to hit play just to make sure I've set up my buttons correctly. All right, so all of my buttons have the hover and pressed state. That's good. And my text is pretty readable. I might want to make it actually a bit larger so that it is really clear to read. So anytime you use a fancy font, you want to make sure that it is very large so that the user doesn't have any trouble reading it. So I am going to make this a little bit larger. All right, now that I'm pretty happy with my start screen setup, the next thing that I want to do is I want to make a options menu. So the way that I've organized this is I have a panel called Start Menu that is on my canvas. There are 2 different ways to organize UI that is going to be in the same scene. You could have more than one canvas, or within a canvas you could have more than one panel. The downside to having more than one canvas is that the event system will only know how to identify one canvas at a time. And so if you ever have two canvases active, it can cause problems. So if you were going to organize it by having more than one canvas, you would need to make sure that you always disable one of them before enabling another one. So to just keep things simple, I'm actually just going to organize things by having multiple panels on a single canvas. This is the way that I prefer to organize things, and I think that it will work well for this type of a menu setup. So I'm going to create another panel, and you can see that it has turned gray over the whole screen. So this new panel covers the full width and height of the screen, and the order things appear in the canvas, this is the order that they will be rendered. So if I drag this panel up to the top, now it's actually behind everything else. So I'm going to drag it back down so it's in front of everything else. This is going to be my options menu. I'm going to name it so it's easy to find. And the options menu, I want it to not actually fill the whole screen. I want to be able to see some of my start screen behind it. So the way that I would do that is I would give it some buffer pixels on the left, right, bottom, and top. So let's try 150 for the left and the right, and maybe 100. Let's try 75, about 50. 50 for the top and the bottom. And so I'm just trying to get it to fill sort of the center area of the screen. Now my pop-up panel, I do want it to be fully opaque so that I can't see the buttons behind it. And I am going to use my rectangle again. I could choose a different color for this one, so maybe I could make it darker. And I'm actually going to give a little more buffer space at the top so that I can see the game title still. And I'm just going to take a look in my game view. So I have my start screen. The user presses the options button and it would pop up this options overlay on top of the start menu. So if I had some background art going on around the sides or the back, I would still be able to see it around my options menu pop-up. So then I would put some buttons on my options menu. So I'd go under UI. First thing I would probably do actually is I'd put text on my options menu that would say options, so the user knows which screen they are on. I will center the text again. Since I have a dark background now, I probably want very light colored text or maybe white text. And I'm going to choose one of my more readable fonts, and I'm going to increase the size. And I could add an outline again if I wanted to. Since my text this time is white, I would probably use black as my outline text. It is not super noticeable, but it does help a little bit just to make that text pop from the background. And I want to make sure that I center my text. And this one, I am going to once again bind it to the top, but one thing that's interesting that you'll see here is it's not actually binding to the top of the screen. It's binding to its parent, which is the options menu panel. So it is actually binding itself to the top of the options menu, which is exactly what I want. If it was binding to the top of the screen, what might happen is, depending on the screen size or resolution, the options text might actually come up above the panel, which I would not want. So then I would go ahead and add some buttons. For an options menu, I might also have some sliders. Maybe I have a volume slider. And anytime you're adding something to a panel, make sure you drag it onto the panel so it's a child of that panel. I'm just setting up a few things to use as examples. Now, when the user is done filling in their options, they need a way to get back to the main screen. So I would add a button And I'm going to set it up to use sprite swap again. And set native size. Make sure you drag the button onto the options menu panel, and then this is going to be my back button. I could also say main menu here. There's different ways that I could do this. I'm just going to say back, but basically what I'm trying to convey here is that when the user is done, they return to the previous screen. You could also, since the user is inputting some settings, you could also say accept, let the user know that they are accepting the changes that they have set. What might be a good thing here actually is to give the user an option, either to accept the changes or to go back to the main scene without accepting their changes. So I could potentially have two buttons here, an accept button and a cancel button. And I'd want to make sure I'm choosing my font and bring up that font size. And maybe I should spell cancel correctly. That would help. And lastly, I want to make sure that these buttons are going to stay with the correct part of the panel. So I'm going to bind them each to the nearest corner. So this one I will bind to the bottom right corner, and the cancel button I will bind to the bottom left corner. Now I want to double check and make sure that I have parented everything correctly. So I'm just going to toggle the options menu on and off so I can see that it comes with all of the UI assets that I have intended to attach. Now, if you're going to have your options menu available in more than one scene, what you might want to do is create a prefab of your options menu so that it's easy to bring it into other scenes without losing any of the changes that you might make along the way. So I'm going to make a new folder called Prefabs and double click on this folder, and I'm just going to take my options menu and drag it into my prefabs folder. So now I have this panel saved as a prefab, and now what I can do is I can take it into other scenes. So I'm going to save my start screen for now, and I'm going to create a new scene, and I'm going to save this scene in my scenes folder, and I'm going to call this game view. This is where I would probably be setting up my heads-up display. And so I'm going to have the ability for the player to open the options menu from the main game view. So I'm going to create UI canvas, and just as before, change constant pixel size to scale with screen size. I always want to do that first. Then, now I have this canvas set up, I am going to take my options menu prefab and drag it onto the canvas. And so now I can see this is the exact same options menu that I created in the other scene. And I can turn this off for a bit while I work on my heads-up display. So the heads-up display would appear on this screen. The background, what I would see here is actually the game view. So if you are creating UI for an existing game, you could take a screenshot of that game to put behind here to use as a reference while you're putting together your heads-up display. The heads-up display might include things like a health and ammo counter or a mana bar, as well as things like a mini-map and maybe some other UI elements like a timer. So I'm going to add a text first. Maybe this is how many points the player has gotten. So I might say score 0. And I want to make sure to choose colors for my heads-up display that will look good with the background of what will be the actual game view. So it is helpful to have a reference image of what the game is supposed to look like. Even if you're making this for a game that doesn't exist yet, you could use a reference image as the background so that you get a sense of what the UI should look like on top of it. So I'm going to have a player score. This is probably going to be in the top center. And I would bind this to the top of my screen. And probably I would want my font size here to be a bit larger. And I would probably also give it an outline. And I'm going to choose the font that I want to use here. Now maybe my game has a player icon that would go in the bottom left corner that might have a health and a mana bar. So I'm going to create just a placeholder. I'm going to create an image here, which will go in the bottom left corner. And I'm going to use my sliced rectangle so that it's easy to resize. So this is just going to represent what's going to eventually be my player icon. So I can adjust the width and height here. And since I sliced this image, it will resize and look okay. I'm going to make sure to bind it to the bottom left. And now I'm going to say, let's say I have a slider here for the health bar. Now when you use a health bar, it's really easy to set up a health bar using a slider because the slider comes with this value that you can adjust from code, which is really easy to keep track of the health with. But it's important that we want to make sure that we turn off this handle because the handle is something the player can click and drag. And if we leave that on, the player can actually adjust their own health. So I'm going to toggle open the slider, and under the handle slider area, there is a handle object, and I can just uncheck the box to turn that off. And now as I'm adjusting the value, you can see that it is filling up here. I'm going to give it a different color also. Oops. For the fill area. So I'm going to toggle open the fill area and select the fill and give it a different color here. And so I can see, maybe I'll use a red or orange color for the health. Now you can see that it doesn't actually fill all the way up, even when the value is all the way at the maximum. So the way to fix that is on the fill area, the left is set to 5 and the right is set to 15. This is to give space for the handle, but we can just set this to 5 so that it matches the left side. So now it fills all the way up, and we can test that by adjusting our slider value here. So this would be my health slider, and I might put it behind my player icon. And maybe I would have a second one for the mana, which I would give a different color. And I would also want this to be behind the image. And so now I have a player icon with a health bar and a mana bar, and I have my score at the top. I maybe would have a mini map, or I would have some different icons for abilities the player can use, or maybe an inventory bar at the bottom. But for now, this is all I'm going to set up for my heads-up display. And I just want to show how to organize it. So I have my options menu and my heads-up display in the same scene. So I do want to have all of my heads-up display organized together. So I'm going to create another panel. But this time I'm going to uncheck the box for image. So I'm going to basically remove this image so it is not covering up the area in the screen. I could uncheck this raycast target to make sure that it is not going to block the user from clicking on things, although I don't have anything in my heads-up display right now that the user would click on. And then I can select all of this heads-up display content that I've made and drag it onto this panel. And then I might rename this panel as HUD. So now I have my content organized so that I can easily see which things are on my HUD versus my options menu. So that's how to get started organizing your UI elements into different scenes and different panels to keep everything organized. Make sure you always save your scene. So I'm going to save this one, and I can go back to my start menu. And so then the next part of this tutorial will cover how to add some animations to different aspects of the UI so that things can sort of animate onto the screen as opposed to just being static. I hope you found this helpful, and I hope you'll like and subscribe.